fortuitous. We never talked to each other. You've ended where I wanted to begin.
Okay, good.
So this is good. This is good. One of the major problems to move forward, I think, before you can move forward, is to really identify where people are. Mm-hmm. What is the problem that they have got? And we'll talk about maybe what problems we've got as well, because there are always two parts to a conversation.
Right.
But I'd love to start with where we think the problem is and where people are. Because in the video that you saw, and to prepare for this, I looked at some of the field tapes we'd shot of some of the rallies counter to the I Am a Muslim Too rally here in New York in March. Saw the placards, and we saw a few of them up there. Heard people talk. It seemed to me they were very fearful, and they were ignorant in many ways of Islam. Mm-hmm. How, and I'll ask all of you, but Eboo first, when you look at others and you see their anger towards you or whatever it is, where do you see their problem?
Right. So let me tell you what a moment in my life about 4 years ago that was of profound relief to me. And I didn't realize the weight that was being lifted from me in this moment. But I was at an event at Zaytuna, which is, then it was a seminary, now it's a college, but it's the first Muslim institution of its kind in the country. And Zaytuna is founded and led by probably the most important Muslim intellectual, definitely in America, maybe in the Western Hemisphere, Sheikh Hamza Youssef. And it's somebody I've been blessed to get to know over the past 7 or 8 years. And he made a comment during his speech at that event. He said, "We are the first generation to allow Islam to look ugly." And I got to tell you something. I felt like 1,000 pounds lifted from my shoulders. Because I thought to myself, man, for all of these years, I've run around feeling like I had to hug my religion and blame people who think it's ugly, right? And what Sheikh Hamza was saying was hey, we've allowed this to happen. And you know what? It's okay to admit it's happening. The most important Muslim leader in the Western Hemisphere just said it in front of a crowd of 500 people. Right? And the reason I tell that story is because if all I knew about Islam was what many people know about Islam, including relatively well-informed people, I would have the same opinions that they would. Right? And more Muslim leaders that I respect, including Imam Faisal, have been saying this. I just did an interview with Imam Faisal in Chicago, and somebody got up and asked the question about, why are so many people afraid of Muslims? And Imam Faisal was like, I'm afraid of Muslims, of some Muslims. Right? I mean, let's not suggest that this fear is entirely misplaced. There are a set of dangerous people in the world who pray in Arabic and who are really good at getting on television. That's part of what they do. And let's have a sense, again, we live in a political community called America. And if a third to a half of our fellow countrymen, I want to keep on saying that, these are people that I trust to build this nation, right? A third to a half of my fellow countrymen are suspicious and fearful about something. That doesn't mean that they're right. But it does mean that I ought to take it seriously. And frankly, I think one baseline definition of democracy is you take how other people in your country feel seriously. Right?
Do you think there's a systemic problem? And I'll bring Yvette in, if I may, just on this one. Eboo said we've got to hold our hands up. At least going into a dialogue, you've got to say, me too. Maybe there's something about me. You talk about a systemic problem in religion per se. It seems to me that could also be said of every other religion, of Christianity, of Judaism, that there has to be that hands up, me too as well.
Yes.
And why? And what is the problem though? Why does religion have such a problem in doing that?
Because I think the nature of religion is to visit the flaws on the other. Obviously, again, if I believe this, I believe it because I believe it is right. And by default, that suggests if you believe something else, then it is wrong. And the same realities are visited, I'm red stated, you're blue stated. You know, I'm Republican, you're Democrat. You know, I'm a woman, you're a man. What we love is binary constructs. We love the idea of salt and pepper, light and dark, good and evil. And consequently, what we believe ourselves to hold fast to is the thing that we believe is right, even when we are kind. Even, you know, some of the most difficult people in the world to deal with, for me, have been liberals who believe themselves far better than people who are conservative. And so the idea of the other, the rightness against the wrongness, is fundamentally a part of what religion not only embodies but requires. How do you know that you believe a thing? How do you know that the thing that you believe is right? It has to be at a juxtaposition to what someone else believes. Then in addition to that, if there is any sense of less than-ness for you as a person, your comeuppance, the way that you are greater in the world, is often at the expense of someone else.
So to enter into the conversation constructively, we have to get our own head right
Absolutely.
to begin with.
We have to own our own stuff. And owning our own stuff is what is problematic. And it's visceral, it's human. It's not a question of our ability to even intellectualize it. We have to own to what my brother is saying, we have to own what our folks, what the people who have been connected to, let me say this in an even more personal way. When I spent time in Ghana, and I met the brother who was the prime minister, for lack of a better way to say it, to the traditional king. And he said to me, sister, I'm of the Akan people, he said to me. He said, and we have never been slaves. We have never been slaves. And then he went on to tell me about how the Akan people had even gone into the interior to bring African people out to barter with the Portuguese and with the English. And I'm listening to him telling me this as though this is a badge of honor. He said, you know, we have never been. So I got enough of it. To which I said to him, first of all, I don't understand why that's something to celebrate, first of all. Okay? Secondly, I am the progeny of slaves. And therefore, my DNA has survived slavery and Jim Crow and lynchings and burnings. So apparently there's something in me that is not in you. Evidently my DNA has got more chutzpah than yours does, okay? And it was a frustrating moment for me, but it was important for me because I went away from there with it in my knowledge that we are complicit as African people in African slave trade. That's hard for me to hear, but in order for us to understand that evil institution, we have to understand and own our piece of it. That is what is so problematic for us.
And not feel undermined by the fact
Yes.
that maybe you've been victims. And,
Exactly.
And I'd like to move on to David on that score, how you would see that. Again, to get our heads straight before we enter into the conversation. The idea that have we been too obsessed with the idea of victimization and being victims, and that we should open up more? Within Judaism, for example, do you find that a problem?
When one sense of victimization gives one a sense that they can claim whatever they want as a result of that, then I think it's really counterproductive and harmful. I think for all groups, the challenge of how you denounce extremists within your own community. And let me just, I was having a lot of trouble with the lighting and the placement of this, reading my notes. Let me just make one point about extremists. And this, when I'm talking about extremists, I'm not talking, this isn't a theological comment. I don't care about someone's theology, how fundamentalist their theology is. To me, a religious extremist is somebody who, in the name of their religion, is willing to use violence to impose their views on the broader society or upon those who religiously disagree with them, or even not using violence, is willing in the name of religion to dehumanize people who differ with them. So that's the category that I'm talking about. And how we challenge those in our own midst is always the hardest thing to do, particularly for minority religions. I think it's, and minority groups, by the way, in general, but minority religions in any given society, you feel even more vulnerable as a group. And therefore, you're worried that if you speak out, you may be seen as disavowing your own. On the other hand, if you don't do it, then how do you have any claim for anyone else to do it?
Yes.
So I'm proud in the Jewish community here in New York of the universal efforts to delegitimize Meir Kahane, and 30 years ago here in New York. I'm troubled by the fact that random vigilante settler violence on the West Bank, sometimes done in the name of religion against the Palestinian residents who live there, there is not denounced with the same fervor that this is. You can't ask others, where are you denouncing your extremists? Where are the Hindus in India denouncing Hindu extremists? Where are the Christians here denouncing Christian extremists? Where are the Muslims denouncing Muslims? If we don't do the same our own. But that's one place we can just help stake out a position, all of us together as religious groups, that we are going to stand behind each other and respect that you have to decide the best way to do it in your faith community. We have to decide the best way to do it in our faith community, but we all have to do it.
So if we can say the first point, if we worked out the necessary conditions for constructive dialogue, perhaps the first one is get your head straight, me too, be honest, be open, and admit that perhaps where I'm coming from hasn't got the solutions anyway. So we've got a level playing field. Second one, to try and work out the need. I guess both sides have a need. So Eboo, when you have come across opponents, when you have seen the banners saying no Sharia in America, Muslims represent the undermining of the American way, and they're forceful, what do you see in them? What are they needing? What have they got wrong?
So I think I did a talk at the University of Puget Sound, this past year, and there were 3 people in the audience who kind of sat up front, and they had basically I hate Islam shirts on. And I was like, wow, the Q&A is going to be interesting, right?
There's nobody out here, is there, with that? I can't see that.
They had pads of paper with them, right? So, of course, one of them stands up as the first questioner and basically just lists a series of atrocities that some Muslims have committed, in the last couple of years. And she went on and on and on, and people in the audience started not only denouncing but heckling her, right? And part of me is thinking to myself, like, I've just given a 45-minute talk on the importance of American pluralism and the gentleness and beauty of Islam, and I am, with literally a facial expression, I could deny my whole talk, right? I mean, and how do I act in a way that's consistent with the talk? So the first thing I did was to say, all of those things that you articulate, I want to just affirm they're atrocities. There is zero excuse for them, right? Like, I don't, in a way, I don't care what happens such that this person who calls himself a Muslim decides to do those things, right? I want to own those as atrocities. The other thing I want to do is to offer you an alternative understanding of what Islam is, right? Mm-hmm. Because 1.5 billion people and anything that's 1,400 years long can't only be bad. Just no rational person can think of something that's that wide as bad. So I'm going to offer you a couple of other things. I want to offer you the example of Badshah Khan. I want to offer you a couple of phrases from Rumi. I want to offer you a couple of verses from the Quran. And then I'm going to say, look, it's your decision what you choose to take as Islam.
Were these people open to that? How do they respond?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Did you think
it's not like the woman applauded me.
You
know what I mean? But
you didn't convert her.
No, but there is actually a very, very important story in Islam about this, which is in the very early days of the Prophet's preaching in Mecca, there was a man named Umar who was after him with a sword, who thought that the presence of the Prophet was so dangerous to the equilibrium in Mecca and the tribal relationships that he was going to kill him. And a woman told Umar, before you kill the Prophet, just come here and listen from the window to this poetry. and it was the prophet inside a house preaching the Quran, right? And Umar didn't know it at the time, but he was so entranced by the beauty of it that he walked in and said, I want to know what this is. And then he's told that it's the prophet in the Quran, and he converts. But that's a very important story, right? Because for me, it's the story of beauty over violence, right? And I think it would have been a success story even if he didn't convert, right? That beauty, Dostoevsky said, beauty will save the world. And in my more literary moments, I believe that. But that's my job is not to, I don't control how that woman acts or thinks. I control how I respond to her question.
And I'd like to pick up on that, how that woman thinks, because to understand how we've got to move someone, you need to understand where they are and what the rules of their mind is when it comes to movement. And I'm going to move to Yvette on this one, because you started in a fundamentalist Christian tradition. So what insights can you give us about what was going on in the mind of that woman standing in front of Eboo with a T-shirt, and how she didn't hear Eboo when he talked about the positive side of Islam and just wanted to get across the negative?
I think we are often personally victimized by what we are taught to believe. And we hold those things near and dear to us that are taught to us by the people in whom we have the greatest confidence. And those things sort of become a part of our DNA. Once again, and I was in South Africa once, and I was on a bus of African-American Christian folks, and we were going to the marketplace. And it was a sister that was on that bus that before we got to the marketplace, she got up and got in the aisle. And she said, now, sisters and brothers, she said, be careful when you go to the marketplace, that you not buy any statues or any masks. Because if you do that, you could be bringing evil spirits into your home when you take these things home. So you can buy some jewelry, she said, and clothing, but stay away from images. I thought it was incredible hearing this from an African-American woman speaking to African-American people about African art. And essentially, she had been so indoctrinated against her own culture that she was teaching people against her own culture and feeling that it was the right thing to do. Here was somebody who is from Africa in terms of her history, but who has been synthesized through a white Protestant model, essentially, in this country, to believe that her basic self is heathen and demonic, and she's vilifying her own history. I said that to say that the incredibly important lesson is that the folks like this sister that was in the audience in Eboo's session is indoctrinated to believe a certain number of things about other people, and undoing that is a huge work when the temptation is to assimilate the oppressor.
So I'm glad you've drawn attention to that. It's a fundamental, very important position. Everyone out here, I guess, will come across people from a very entrenched, indoctrinated position within their faith group.
I just say, and she is probably also victimized by the same oppressor she is seeking to assimilate in that moment.
But if she isn't hearing, refuses to hear, doesn't have the capability of hearing, how can we move forward? What do you do to that girl? What do you say to that girl?
It is not the learning, it's the unlearning. That's what one of my friends said to me.
Who can unlearn? Can anyone here, for example, who's coming not from a fundamentalist position, help unlearn? Or is it actually, the only hope, is for her own faith leaders?
Can I, by way of personal testimony, as I don't know how many fundamentalists or recovering fundamentalists are on the stage today, but I do know of one that I could definitely speak to in terms of my own life and experience. Undoing the teachings of fundamentalist faith has everything to do with understanding that fundamentalism usually comes from a place of feeling already less than and finding or needing to find a connection to something that makes you greater, not just as great, but greater than what you feel oppressed by, right? Consequently, for me, making the transition from being a fundamentalist Christian to being what is often now called a liberation theologian, being able to make that shift, had to do with first a sense of self, a sense of relationship with God, if I can use that in those sort of Christian terms, a personal sense of value by my Creator. But even more than that, it became a quest for knowledge, for understanding the languages of the text, for understanding the history, the interrelationships between one faith and the other. Knowledge is power. And it had an enormous amount of shift and change for me. Then learning to understand and accept who I am. I'm a same-gender loving woman, a woman theologian, and an African-American. That's like a walk-in justice issue. You know what I mean? And so having to come home to myself in all of those areas. And then to reach out, both of my brothers said it so eloquently today, to reach out in my own family, my fundamentalist evangelical Pentecostal mother who stopped talking to me at a certain point in my faith walk. My mother, who passed in 2007, by the way, I made a decision about 10 years before my mother died that I was going to have a relationship with my mother. And the question was, how am I going to do that? How am I going to bring my mother from being a list writer and a list person, from that, and quoting scriptures and proof texting on me all the time, right? How was I going to get her and I to walk together harmoniously? And I can tell you very quickly that I started talking to my mother on Mondays after her service on Sundays. And I let her tell me everything that happened in her service and how God moved. And I said, great. And I said, so what would you like to do today? And I knew what it was, shopping. And so I'd go get her, put her in the car, and we would go shopping. And we would just shop and shop and shop. And along the way, we had these conversations while I'm carrying her bags, you know, from Saks to Nordstrom's, you know, we're shopping. And I'm carrying her bags. And we kept talking about theology, and we kept talking. And to your point, we kept talking, and he said, well, if Yvette can go shopping with me, she can't be all that bad. If Yvette will have lunch with me, if Yvette will talk to me about my worship experience, she can't be all that bad. And one day my mother said to me when I was talking, she said, shut up, Yvette. I said, well, okay. And I stopped talking, you know. And later I said, so why did I have to shut up? She said, because you're starting to make sense. And if what you say is true, she said, I may have spent 60 years of my life doing some things that I did not have to do. It was quite a moment, but I understand how shift happens. It is relational, it is based on knowledge, and it is based on human contact. I
think that's one of the most important things coming across from all three of you, how the shift happens. It's trust, it's sharing on a neutral, safe territory.
Yes.
But one of the dangers, I mean, we've talked about, I know you have, is the binary position that we always tend to take up within religion. And one thing I want to say is let's look at ourselves, and David, perhaps I can move on to you on this one. Nothing personal, but on behalf of us all. You know, are we in danger of saying, we're right, you more conservative groups are wrong, you have to shift? Because if it's saying, look, you've been misled perhaps by your leaders, you've got to shift, it seems no one's going to join us if that's the stance we take.
Two very brief stories. One, John Ruskin, the great 19th century British art and literary critic, talks about people who are critics who are evaluating art are subject to what he calls the ruling hypothesis, that they come to a conclusion before they actually encounter what's going on about it, and then they read and interpret everything through the filter of that ruling hypothesis. Very hard to shake people, but you talked about personal stories, human interactions. You talked about this dialogue that goes on where people listen to it. So the other story is the Jewish tradition 2,000 years ago. At the earliest stage of the Talmudic era, there were two major schools of thought. Hillel and Shammai. They debated sometimes for years over esoteric points of law, to which the text, supposedly in the divine name, observes, these and these are the words of the living God. Now, it didn't mean they were all equally true, but it meant the act of exploring and trying to understand what God wants from us, that we can never fully know, that act and process brings us into the encounter with the divine. If we are open to putting aside our ruling hypothesis and listen with an open mind, they said, whose law usually prevailed? Hillel's. Why? Because he always heard the other side first. If we're really open to listening to the other and finding truth, I really think there are ways that we find truth on both sides. Because yes, I think there is a kind of arrogance on both sides. Fundamentalism that we're familiar with on the conservative or religious fundamentalist side, but liberals, who are saying, listen, we know what works for you is fine, what works for me is fine. You do your thing, I'll do my thing. We all know, except that I'm actually right and you're wrong. We know that goes on. But in the last 15 years, a number of us have created a whole bunch of strange bedfellow coalitions that have brought together some of the staunchest evangelical leaders, Pat Robertson and Chuck Colson, and folks like that, with some of the mainline figures in the Protestant community and historic black churches in the Reformed Jewish movement, to work together on a whole bunch of issues where I think the evangelicals, I don't mean evangelicals, the fundamentalist wing of the evangelicals, and some of the early people got involved in politics, as wrong as I thought they were on a whole range of stuff, I think they're right about talking about why are the mainstream groups not talking about the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of community, the breakdown of morality in our society, the rising rates of divorce, and drug abuse in our society. Where are the voices on those issues? If it can be passed by a law, a food stamp program, they're all for it. Otherwise, we don't hear them. And I think they're right. So on the issue of Sudan and the Sudan Peace Act and sex trafficking, that we brought some of them to sweatshops to see economic human trafficking. They broadened the bill as a result of that to include human trafficking and prison rape. And debt relief. I remember sitting in the room off the Oval Office with Bono the rock star on one side and Pat Robertson on the other side here, because those groups had missions out there and they knew the impact of debt relief. And we were really able to engage in finding common ground. Out of that, there have been real shifts. Shifts on our end and the kinds of issues we engage with, but shifts on their end, opening up what it meant to be concerned about God's presence in the world in ways far beyond the stereotypical social issues of abortion, gay rights, and stem cell research and evolution here in the first generation. So when Rick Warren says, my biggest mistake was poverty and failure to address poverty, I'm going to commit the rest of my life to it, he's speaking for a wide swath of folks who get now climate change and get poverty, and get this transforming the evangelical world in this sense. So change does happen, but we have to be open to listening to each other and finding common ground.
Yes.
So before I open it up for questions from the audience, I wanted to give half an hour, and we've got half an hour before lunch, so it's a good point to move on. Just to sum up what we were feeling the necessary conditions were for constructive dialogue. One is, don't be so defensive. 2, be open. 3, be willing to find common ground, both in terms of, we got it wrong, there are people doing wrong in our neck of the woods as well as yours, and hey, there are people on your side doing amazing things that are right that we find commonality with. So, and the other one that you were all talking about was actually getting off our backsides and going out and meeting people, and through constructive events, build trust. Eboo, final word from you before we throw it open to everybody. Can you think of an event where perhaps you were surprised where someone changed, you were in conversation with, the impossible happened, the dialogue happened, and you both moved forward?
Yeah. So 2 quick things. Number 1, my sense is that the people in this, if we are only participants in interfaith cooperation, this is going to be a minority movement forever, right? It's always only going to be a niche movement. Our job is to be leaders of that, of this movement. And here's what I mean by that we are creating spaces for other people to increase their knowledge and to expand their encounters. And people who are in positions of leadership, who are creating those spaces, who are doing what Frankie and others involved in Prepare New York are doing, which is setting up 500 conversations, right? We have special responsibilities. One of them is to not say, I really like this guy and I don't really like that guy, right? So, which is one of the reasons that while I happen to, on many issues, be politically and socially progressive, that is subsumed in what I consider a higher value for my current calling, which is pluralism, which is the definition of pluralism is that people from different points of view have a relationship with each other. They can do some things together. So if my opening of said space is to say, well, this guy is enlightened and this guy's indoctrinated, now you guys talk, that's not a great way of creating a space where those two people are gonna have a relationship. Okay, so here's my quick story. So a couple years ago, I was invited to Australia to this conference on religious diversity in Australia, and it was they had what you have done here is you've taken people with largely similar viewpoints, a set of interesting stories, but I would say broadly speaking similar viewpoints, and you've had us seek to express and illuminate on a couple of common questions. That is one way of doing this. Another way of doing it is taking 2 people or 3 people with very, very different viewpoints and having them cage fight on stage, right? Which is what happened in Australia. So anyway, I'm there, and they got the scariest looking dude from the scariest looking Christian dude and the scariest looking Muslim dude, and they put them on stage. And I got to tell you something, we are always going to win on that, right? The Muslims are always going to, our beards are longer, our faces are fiercer, we're going to win. And my guy was scary. I mean, and the dude seriously looked like he'd walked out of a 12th century cave. He had on like a long tattered robe. The dude had a staff, right? I'm like, here I am. I'm the guy talking about the gentleness and beauty in Islam, and here's my symbol. Anyway, I was like, so the Christian guy starts, and he says, I grew up in Pakistan in a village, and I never met one good Muslim. All the Muslims ever did was harass me. All the Muslims ever did was threaten my family. When my church was burned down, none of the Muslims in my village came to my aid. And then he ends his monologue, and it's clear like this guy is on the circuit doing this. I mean, like his tone is pitch perfect, the emotive quality. I mean, like this is. I'm like, man, you get like 10K a pop for this, right? And so he ends by saying, the only thing that I am grateful for from these Muslims is that none of them truly followed the Prophet, because if they did, I would be dead. Right? I'm the interfaith guy in the audience. My throat is tightening, right? Like my veins are pumping hot blood. I'm glad my dude has a staff, right? And I'm like listening. I'm like crusades, I'm like tell him all the stuff, right? Like my guy turns around and he says, I wish I was in that village because I would have protected you. Because none of those Muslims you knew did what Islam calls them to do. He says, I know what I'm supposed to do right now is denigrate your religion, but the truth is I have too many Christian friends and I have too much respect for Jesus to do that. And I was like, dude. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. And here's, I'm going to end with this, which is what the guy did was actually not a feat of physical marvel. He just strung together 4 sentences, right? In other words, what he did, any of us could do. He just chose to respond to ugliness with something different. Like he made a decision just like you did with your mother. You just made a decision at some point, which is, I'm going to have a relationship with this person, and the only way to have a relationship is to shop with her. That's it, right? So he just said, I am not going to argue with this guy, and the way I'm not going to argue with him is to, number one, tell him that what happened to him was wrong, and it wasn't Muslim, and then to tell him a couple things that I admired about his religion. It wasn't that hard. But in that moment, it was so dramatic. And so I think to myself, you know, in moments that are a lot less dramatic, how do I as a participant respond to ugliness with something a little less ugly? And then how do we as leaders create spaces where it is more common for positive knowledge and positive encounter to happen rather than ugliness?